we are ready.
Hi, I'm Jyoti Fernandes, and I'm a farmer in Dorset, in England, in the southwest. Yesterday I was shearing my sheep all day, but I'm with the Landworkers Alliance, and we're a union of small-scale farmers, foresters, and land-based workers. So a lot of people who work on other farms as well. We're part of Via Campesina, which is an international peasants movement. It's a union worldwide for peasant farmers and land-based workers all around the world who try and grow food for themselves and their local communities, working with nature. We use a way of farming called agroecology, where we try and look at what's in the local environment around us and produce food using those resources in a really sustainable way and sell them to people in our local community. Also process a lot for our own family and for our own consumption, so that we can have healthy, nutritious diets. So in the UK here, we try and work so that we have more of a voice in our political system, because for a long time, agriculture here, the government has seen it as a way to try and modernize and go towards more intensive farming and to look at global export markets, and thought that we could bring in our food from all across the world. But we feel that it's really important that we have local food economies where we, have more of a connection to the people around us in our communities and grow for them, so that you can really see where your produce goes, and you can know the people that are eating your food, because it's much more rewarding, and it means fewer food miles and really good quality food.
Yeah, Jyoti, I've followed the Landworkers Alliance for a while. My name is Anja Lyngbaek, by the way, and I am from Denmark. Hi, and I work with Local Futures and have also been producing food throughout many years as a smallholder. And you yourself, you're also a smallholder, right?
Yeah. So I've got a 40-acre farm with 2 families that live here, and I've got 4 daughters and my husband, and we have sheep on the farm. So yesterday we were doing all the shearing, and they live underneath our orchards, where we have lots of apples and pears and plums that we can produce preserves and cider and apple juice from. And then we have a lot of market garden vegetables, all different kinds of tomatoes and different, fruit and vegetables that grow all through the season that we can sell to the local markets. And then I have some dairy cows that we milk and make cheese. So it's a really proper mixed farm. The animals can make manure, and that manure can be composted and then put onto our vegetable patches, or it's nice because everything works together. We find on our farm here that if we have diversity in what we're doing, it means we're not producing loads of one thing, and if it happens to go wrong that year, then we don't have an income, or if the weather is really crazy, we have different things happening in different parts of the farm, and one year something will work and another year something else will work better. And it means we're more resilient because we've got that diversity we can rely on. And it also means there's a lot more connections between what we do on the farms. So animals can have a lot of the time what's the waste products of another part of your farm. So when we press our apples here, for example, we have loads of apple pulp afterwards, and that can be fed to the cows. And it means that those cows aren't relying on having so much imported feed that might come from really far across the world and have an impact on other people's land. The way you have diverse systems means that you can recycle within what's going on the farm, and it's just so much more resilient, and it's so much more exciting, and it makes for more interesting jobs because you can do lots of different things as well.
I'm in Denmark right now. Now in Denmark we are, I think, maybe close to 6 million people today, and we produce every year around 30 million pigs. Most of it obviously is by export, because Danes can't eat 30 million pigs. And so this is a very good example of the madness, as I see it, of the global food system, because we produce 30 million pigs with imported food, for example, from the Amazon and other places, undermining other people's food security, obviously causing huge environmental disasters. And then we export most of that, for example, to China. So this is like the polar opposite of what you're saying. Lots of food miles, lots of pollution, lots of CO2 emissions, a real recipe for disaster. But when you look at food and farming just from a pure economic point of view, you get that kind of madness within this global economy, you know? So
Yes.
Landworkers Alliance, as far as I understand it, it's not just small producers, it's also farm workers. It's small and medium scale.
Yeah. I mean, we have farms of all different sizes in some ways. You know, we say small because that's, you know, the way, the English way we can understand being part of a peasant movement. And you know, La Via Campesina is a coalition of peasant farmers. And, you know, some of those might be, you know, a reasonably large farm in Canada. The National Farmers Union of Canada is part of La Via Campesina, but it's about the values that we farm with. And it's about food not just being a commodity, you know, that can be bought, sold, and traded and shipped around the world. And the main goal of it is to make money for an agribusiness company. You know, it's about food being something that's actually valued as fundamental to life. And when you farm, you're producing that food because you believe it has values to society in providing, you know, really good quality food security, you know, independence, you know, and a way to look after the environment at the same time as when you're producing that. So all of our farmers have that basic core principles of the values of farming as something that's really important to all of us.
Can you just share a little bit more about Via Campesina? Because it is a huge international movement that most people have never heard of.
Yes. So La Via Campesina it's a network or a coalition of different farmers' unions in countries across the world. And it has 200 million members of La Via Campesina. So, you know, it's pretty big and substantial, and we have crazy meetings where, you know, everybody has to come to a consensus about what we're going to fight for, you know, to protect our interests as peasant farmers across the world. But it's also very powerful because you need to bring that many people together to really fight the globalization of our food system, you know, because big agribusiness, you know, Monsanto, Cargill, Syngenta, you know, these companies have a lot of power and they're really dominating the narrative of what feeds the world. But La Via Campesina came together to say, you know, what they've been promoting in terms of, you know, all the agrochemicals that need to go in our crops, you know, all the infrastructure that needs to be built in order to export food across the world, these free trade agreements, which allow big multinational corporations to trample all over their rights, the land rights, the water rights, the seed rights of small farmers. These need to be fought by a movement that's just as powerful. And to be honest, we're actually more powerful than that in the sense that people are really doing what they believe in. They're living proof that you can feed a lot of the world, you know, with methods of agriculture that are local, that are rooted in the environment, that are rooted in local communities. So there's been some studies. The ETC group did a study that showed that 70% of the world's food security is provided by small and family farms, by the peasant food web. And that kind of shows, you know, the fact that most people don't really realize how much of the world is fed through peasant farmers just shows how strong that narrative that's promoted by these agribusinesses is. You know, that people think these massive fields full of commodity crops are what's feeding the world when they're actually what's destroying the world.
Particularly in highly industrial countries, you have that sense. And it's also what you see, let's say, in a country like Denmark to a large extent, or in the US, who, you know, their livestock production is on massive scales, you know, just the kind of thing that we cannot permit ourselves if we are thinking about, for example, a climate crisis. No, where I was looking at some figures just recently that the average livestock production unit there, broiler chickens, 166,000, 700,000 for egg-laying hens.
The opposite side of that figure is, you know, 70% of the world's food is produced by small producers, but only using 30% of the agricultural resources, where the industrial food chain is using, you know, 70% of agricultural resources to produce only 30% of food. And, you know, there's so much waste embodied in that. That's where you get, you know, the big fields of crops that were maybe grown for a supermarket, but the supermarket rejects it and they get wasted, or a lot of it's used very inefficiently in animal feeds, you know, just pouring far too much grain into animals' necks, you know, for producing it very inefficiently.
For example, the Danish pigs, as just one example. No? But there was a recent study in 2019 that showed that globally, we are handing out $1 million subsidy every minute to industrial farming. And basically the same study showed that only about 1% of that goes to what we could call environmental friendly farming. So it's no wonder that it comes across as being more efficient, as being cheaper on the supermarket shelf, because the industrially produced food from far away is usually cheaper than the locally produced healthy food from around the corner, no? But it's not strange at all if it's already been subsidized all the way, no?
Yeah, and local food has been underinvested in for decades, you know, because this kind of mindset. It's a mindset, and it's also some people have a lot of vested interest in that system that they make money from that system, and so it is difficult to compete. But it's been something here in the UK and the Landworkers Alliance we've been really vocalizing is just how important it is to change that subsidy system, and make sure that smaller farms are supported and enabled to provide healthy, affordable organic food for everybody. So, because it's become a little bit of an issue where when it's been thrown to the market, when food's been thrown to the open market, and it's not an open market, because as you say, the industrialized farms are subsidized, that local organic food in the industrialized countries can often seem very niche, and it can seem very expensive. And is that accessible to all people? Especially on very low income levels. And we think it shouldn't be that way. If there's subsidy going into a food system, and we have a right to food, that food is a basic human right for every human being, then that money should be going to support a better food system, so that the best quality food is accessible to everybody, no matter what income level they're on, and no matter where they live. And if they, and it's either through having, adequate resources to be able to buy that food, or if you're a farm trying to produce that food and you're doing it in an environmentally friendly, high animal welfare way, you get some subsidy to support it, so you don't have to sell as a high-end product, or you provide access to land and water and resources for people to be able to grow their own food. But all across the world, governments should be intervening and taking the right to food seriously, and making sure that everybody has access to good quality food, not just industrial produced food covered in chemicals and full of antibiotics. It's everybody's right to have good food.
Yeah, and I think the way I see the key to that, the place to start would be to shift those subsidies that we are currently handing out to what is essentially highly contaminating and unhealthy, both for the planet and for people, both the ones that work with it, the ones that eat it, and of course for the air, for the water, for the soil, and shift those and give it to the kind of agriculture that is regenerative, that is diverse, and that give people a dignified livelihood. But what I don't think is that we should fall into the category of saying, all right, then we, give some handouts to people, where we are upholding and we are creating a very unlevel playing field, because it's not just like the $1 million in global subsidies per minute, but it's also subsidies to fossil fuels. I mean, I think IMF did a report, I think the last one was in 2015, where they said global subsidies to fossil fuel industry and the order of $5.2 trillion a year. Now, if you were to remove those, obviously, human labor would be much more attractive compared to fossil fuels, just to take one comparison.
The work on farms needs to be dignified and well respected, and that means just giving value to farms that are producing in a way that's good for the human beings who work on them, not covered in pesticides, not huge fields of things where people get very low wages for what they do. All of that's a part of that same picture, and we believe all of it works hand in hand. You've got to have what's best for the climate. You know, we've got a huge climate crisis and a nature crisis that we're facing as a planet. At the same time, there's huge disparities between rich and poor. You know, a lot of workers, you know, having to work very terrible conditions in order to produce food that's being shipped around the world that's still contributing to this climate and nature crisis. And all of this has to be reversed together through, and we think like food systems that are fundamentally good for the people who work in them, that respect them and treat them with dignity. You know, they're good working conditions, they're pleasant places to be. You know, food that stays within your local community, so it's not contributing to air miles, you know, shipping food all across the planet, produced in a way that doesn't release all the nitrates into the atmosphere, you know, looks after the soil health and all the microorganisms, doesn't use so many pesticides, so we've got our bees and insects and, you know, and all these things that we need as the foundation of our natural biodiversity. All of these things are fundamental and they work together, and relocalization is at the heart of a solution that can do all of those things.
Yes, because it's, you know, as it is in this global food market, there isn't any room for small producers either. It becomes a niche. Yeah. Whereas if you have more shorter supply chains, more direct marketing with independent retailers, local independent retailers in between as well, playing their role, it's much more easy for small farmers, to get more of the food dollar, or the part of the money will land, you know, at their table. And it's also easier to diversify, for example, if you are selling, you know, directly or semi-directly to local consumers. Whereas if you are feeding into this massive centralized distribution chain, obviously you are in a situation where you need very large scale, very uniform production. Even so, there's a lot of food waste that you were pointing out earlier on.
Yeah, it's hard for a lot of farmers right here, like in the kind of middle bracket here in the UK at the moment. There's a lot of fruit farmers and vegetable producers who have needed you know, very skilled farm workers to come from Eastern Europe to pick the crops here in the UK. And because of migration laws and because of COVID-19, they're not going to be able to have the numbers of workers coming from Eastern Europe to come and pick crops here. And, you know, and those farmers have been really pressed by an economic system globally, because they're feeding to, you know, they're selling to supermarkets. Our government hasn't paid any attention to putting tariffs, you know, taxes on the fruit, you know, fruit and vegetables coming from other countries that might be produced with lower worker standards or just produced more cheaply in other countries for a long time. And so the margins they get on being able to produce what they produce here in the UK is so small that actually they have to rely on labor from other countries in order to pick those crops, which, you know, who may be able to work at lower wages. And these are tremendously skilled people coming in to do this work. But, you know, it's become a system where we're reliant on labor moving across the world, you know, because you've been competing against produce that's moving across the world. And a lot what needs to be done, there is a solution there in terms of, you know, scaling those farms back down again, helping, you know, get more of a price and a fair price for those farmers, selling to, you know, sort of more direct supply chains rather than to supermarkets, etc. You know, there's a lot of problems that have started to emerge as we get a more distorted, globalized economy that we've got to find a solution to, and a lot of that is about relocalizing and shifting and changing and transitioning those models.
Yeah, and just a moment ago we were talking about the role of subsidies, how one can use that in favor of healthy farming and dignified livelihoods, and supporting the local. For example, one fairly easy thing is using public procurement in support of local produce and services. No, so getting public institutions to buy. Yeah, that's a huge one, because it can have an instant effect and benefit. No? But what another thing, obviously, in this whole thing, like a very big structural thing that we need to change, that you were alluding to, were the trade treaties, the so-called free trade treaties that in essentially only free for for big corporations, and that are pitting farmers against farmers to lower standards, to skip on environmental protection, on working standards. And I lived in Mexico for many years and have seen the effect of the NAFTA free trade agreement between the US and Mexico as well. And that started in 1994. And that was one of the first, well, I think it was the most deregulated free trade treaty. And basically what happened there was that Mexico has been full of small-scale producers producing basic foods such as maize, which is the staple in Mexico, together with beans. And suddenly you got this flood of cheap subsidized maize from very big, large-scale farms in the US coming in, undermining local production. Basically, there are different figures, but it's around 4.9 million people that lost their livelihoods as a consequence because they couldn't compete against this subsidized food. So as a consequence of that, that has driven the migration from Mexico to the US, and we've seen Trump building a wall basically to stop this flood of people.
I was working at the Jimmy Carter Center in 1994 when they were negotiating the NAFTA agreements. And I remember I went to the south of Mexico to talk to farmers there, which is one of the things that inspired me to go into farming. And they were growing these amazing agro-biodiverse systems, the way that the beans and the corn and the squash were all grown together. To me, I found it amazing. And to see the connection to the land and to the culture, especially some of the indigenous communities that were there growing these things, I found it the most inspiring thing probably in my life to inspire me to go into farming and realize just what we lose when we lose that globalized, the globalized food culture, kind of gets rid of that local culture where there's a sense of community and there's a sense of cultural identity associated with how that food is produced as well. But it's interesting. I went back and tried to talk to somebody in the department about it, saying, I think this is going to be a very destructive trade agreement. And I remember him telling me, Jyoti, some people need to lose out in the process of development. That's how we built America. I think I've got to quit now.
Exactly. What is development and what is progress? No.
Yeah. Exactly. And for whom? And for whom? Exactly. Do we design our world system to have losers in the system? And who makes those decisions? And is it our global agribusinesses that are making those decisions about who is going to lose out and what values are important? It's incredibly scary.
And it has it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
Sorry. It goes beyond those impacts, because just to continue along those lines, that all these people that have lost their livelihoods, many of those obviously also have gone into cities in Mexico, around Mexico. So we had increased urbanization, a lot of poor people, a huge increase in consumption of what we call junk food.
Yeah.
Takeover of the retail. So Walmart is now all over Mexico, displacing independent retailers and small shops. So more people there have lost their jobs. And now we have a situation in Mexico where it's #1 country in the world with obesity and diabetes. So all that in a very short span of time. And of course, we can't put it all at the door of so-called free trade, but that was the main factor that drove this change. No? So this is just one example. So if we do not also reconsider how we do our so-called trade treaties, of course, we're going to be trading with other people in other parts of the world. But it has to be subject, to democratic control, which it isn't now, and it has to be subject to human health and planetary health. We can't have treaties that put trade for the sake of trade before climate or before the welfare of people or you know, our water.
Last year there was talk that we would be doing a trade agreement with India. And one of the items that was on the table, because our dairy farmers here for a long time have been getting very low prices, often as low as 14 pence a litre for their milk from the milk processors and from the supermarkets. Now, a dairy farmer in the UK needs at least 25 pence to 29 pence a litre in order to produce milk at a profit. Instead of regulating the supermarkets, which is what our government should have done, and making sure that they were paying a fair price to farmers to produce what they are producing, they were saying, oh, well, we'll negotiate trade agreements and get other countries to buy your milk. You know, we're going to open up new export opportunities for you. We'll invest in things like robotic milkers and technology so you can produce even more than you're producing, and send it all over the world. And so they were, talking about trying to get India to reduce their protections that they've got on the price for dairy farmers there. Now, there's 85 million people in India that are dependent on the dairy industry, 85 million small-scale dairy producers. It's one of the largest milk producers in the world. And that's an incredibly important source of livelihood for the small-scale dairy farmers in India. The average is 2 to 4 cows that a small-scale dairy producer will produce there. And there's state-run cooperatives that will buy that milk at about 70 pence a litre, because there's protections there on that milk. If the milk that came from the UK was exported there as powdered milk, reconstituted and sold on the Indian market, and they couldn't protect their farmers getting a very high price now, that means 85 million people dependent on the dairy industry in India would risk losing their livelihood. That's a huge amount of people to risk losing their livelihood, and the amount of poverty that would start to cause is unbelievable.
In 2000, I was working in the UK, and I was also collaborating with dairy producers in the UK. And, this is now 20 years ago, and they were at that time telling me about the same situation where basically they were forced to sell their milk below production price. Meaning that a lot of the dairy producers had off-farm income, because they couldn't survive otherwise, or the wife might have a job somewhere else, or they might be driving a lorry in their so-called spare time just to make things work. And why couldn't they make a decent living? Because they were being pitted, just like you're saying now, also then against other producers in a global economy. So the example they were using at the time, this was in dairy farmers in the south of England. They're saying they were being pitted by the supermarkets saying, lower your price or we will buy the milk from Irish producers that will give us a lower price. They would say the same thing to the Irish producers.
In Via Campesina, that's what we do, is that we try and work together as small farmers across the world and say, when we're asking for protection for farmers, it's not because we think we're better and you're, and you're bad and we want to have this global competition. Protection is not about just keeping yourself within an isolated national boundary. It's about actually working together. And so us as small farmers in the UK, we suffer from the same globalized, industrialized system and the very large farms as much as the small farmers in India. And so we have to work together in order to, both of us together, look at this global trade system, look at the big agribusinesses and the governments that are negotiating in ways that are against our interests for all of us.
And that's the beauty of thinking of things from a localization perspective, because it's not about protectionism. It is about common sense, and it's about collaborating. But it is allowing everybody to produce for their own needs first, and then you can think from local, regional, national, and international, but in that order, not the other way around. No? So by producing for yourself, you're allowing other people to produce for themselves as well, and use their best land for feeding their own population and trading with surplus, but not putting somebody else's needs before yours. It's not common sense. Exactly. In the present carbon accounting economy, we have this very curious and really criminal situation where all the globally traded goods, the emissions from those globally traded goods are not accounted for anywhere, which makes that whole area seem totally invisible when, you know, you're looking at what the impacts are in terms of emissions and climate and so forth. It wasn't talked about during the Paris Agreement, like the subsidies for the fossil fuels weren't talked about either. So here we have all this food crisscrossing our frontiers in ridiculous way. We call it insane trade because a lot of it is actually people or nations importing and exporting similar produce in similar quantities. Cod fished off the coast in Scotland, having to go to be filleted in China and coming back again on Scottish dining tables, you know, and that's a round trip of 10,000 miles. Now, those 10,000 miles, they're not accounted for anywhere. All that emission is not accounted for anywhere. So that gives a very false picture of the global food system. It doesn't show up its inefficiency. It doesn't show up its role in driving our climate crisis, no? If we had focused on that, then of course, making and supporting local food system is an obvious solution, no?
Absolutely. And I think with local systems, you just have a lot more common sense, you know, because you have a connection. It's a lot more about connecting and understanding what's around you and the limits of the natural environment around you. Once it moves out of your realm of what you can see and what you can know and what you can observe and understand, it becomes harder to visualize and account for all the externalities that happen and how something is produced. If it's there and it's a part of your system and there's a natural limit that you can see and understand, then you're more likely to use common sense in how you use those resources.
Yeah, I mean, because you can be accountable, you can be empowered to do things. It's within your reach. You can see what your arm is doing.
Yes. Exactly. And know what the impact of your actions are. You know, you know, it's very difficult if you're getting, you know, all your feed from soya that's been grown in the rainforest to really know what does that look like on the rainforest, and how does that impact the indigenous people who are dependent on those territories, and what does that look like for the water where all those pesticides are being dumped into the water. You know, if it's so far away, it's hard to visualize. And now media and, you know, the stories that can be shared across the planet can bring those closer to home, but it's still hard for people to really get your head around it. You would never do that to, you know, something right next to you or to people that were your neighbors. But, you know, if it's so hard to see what's happening around the world, then we can't really build those connections so much. But now we've got an opportunity to build global movements and to really, you know, share these stories together so that we can actually take some action, because we are a global family and we all have to work together to make sure that we can bring things closer to home for everybody.
Yes, and it's very clear how after this, or amidst this COVID-19 crisis, that a lot more people are realizing the importance of local and are seeing localization as a strategy for change. No, I think there's broad agreement that we don't want to go back to business as usual, but where do we go from here? No, but so there's both things we can do on a personal level and as a community, but that also has to translate into political change to change those mechanisms that right now are pushing everybody in a direction of more global, more speculative, debt-based economy, you know, within the constraints that we have, where subsidies that we mentioned go towards the big and the global and the polluting rather than the opposite, and where we have the kind of international treaties that put trade above everything else and make climate subject to trade, and make environmental welfare subject to trade. And I'd really like to hear what you as the Landworkers Alliance are able to influence and push through in the UK.
We've been working really hard on an agriculture bill at the moment, you know, and, you know, it's not that the agriculture bill is the best thing ever, but it's an opportunity to talk about agriculture, and it doesn't always get discussed as widely within society as when a major piece of legislation happens, where we're trying to look at changing how the subsidy system works here. Because we're leaving the European Union, it's an opportunity to move away from the common agricultural policy to develop something different. And we felt as a union, if we didn't get to the table, then the voices that would be at the table might do something very different with our agricultural system and our subsidy system than what we wanted to see. And we've been trying to mobilize people who want a better, fairer food system and more ecological, localized food system to help lobby and campaign with us. And what's happening is that it's moving towards a system of public money for public goods. So we're saying that instead of the money being spent on paying farmers for how much land they own, which is the way it's distributed now, that farmers should be being paid for what public goods they deliver. And that sounds very technical and economic, but we're trying to define what that means. So if they're looking after the environment, if they're, if they've got trees and areas for wildlife on their land, if they're reducing their use of pesticide, if they're looking after the soil, and if they're looking after the communities, if they're bringing people to their farms to learn about the farming, and get integrated into farms, then all of those are things which the public should be paying for, rather than just paying for farms for how much land they own. And so that's what we're saying are public goods. And so it's been a really interesting debate, and it's almost a revolution in thinking about what do we want out of our food system, and what do we want out of our farming system, and how do we get the money that's floating around out there to support a better food and farming system to go to be supporting, good local food systems. And also we've been looking at the trade agreements being negotiated and trying to make sure politicians are really aware what happens when you allow this, unregulated global trade. What happens to our domestic food economy? What happens to what's so important to people right now in the UK, as they're getting their local vegetable boxes and caring about where their food comes, concerned about, the lack of food on supermarket shelves. Do they really want to let go of that control and let these big agribusiness companies that, our negotiators might make deals with, and get them to speak up and say, no, we don't want this. Actually, we want some control over what's happening. We want to have food security. We want our farms down the road. Yeah, and to do something about it in the agriculture bill.
So I've noticed that you are getting into the mainstream media now with your voice and with this message, which is quite astonishing, because before there wasn't even an alliance like yours that you were uniting small producers across the board and land workers and so forth. So I see that as a huge achievement.
Yeah, it's been great. We've had fantastic media coverage, and we're also getting a lot of support from all over the political spectrum, because food is something that goes beyond political boundaries. There's a lot of people of all classes, of all political parties that believe in local food and really care about the natural environment. And we speak to people where they're at and say, you've got to speak up. It's not just about what you buy. Your consumer choice is one thing, but it's operating in a wider political system where there's a lot of power out there. And if you don't, speak up, talk to your local MPs, make your MPs actually listen to what you're doing and not just go along with what, the top government negotiators are saying, and get in there and try and change what's happening, then we're not going to win, because there's a lot of vested interest pushing back at this, and we're seeing that critical momentum because people do want that control. It's a very fundamental issue, food is, and we hope that if people can keep that momentum up and not get put down by the fact that, it never feels like we're getting anywhere, that we actually will get somewhere.
When you think about a localization movement, I think food is where to start, because it can bring everybody together. And obviously also because it is key to a healthy local economy. If we don't have food, then we are extremely vulnerable and we'll always be relying on something from far away. That, just as we've seen in this particularly health crisis, how vulnerable we are when that happens.
One of the movements that's really taken off is community supported agriculture. And this also, it has a way of helping address the food poverty issues as well. So community supported agriculture is a farm that's owned by the local community that where the farmers are hired by the local community and paid a fair wage for producing what they do, to sell to people in the community. And it's one where the risk and the reward are shared. So people invest in buying vegetable boxes or meat or dairy or bread, ahead of time. And the farmer knows how much they can grow, and they've got a reasonable sense that they'll get a salary. And, if they happen to have a bad crop that year, that risk is shared by the consumers who have invested in the beginning in that farm. And it means that those people who have invested in the farm have a sense of connection to what's happening on the farm throughout the season, so they can go up there and help harvest the vegetables or pick the apples or milk the goats, or whatever it is, throughout the season, and kind of know and understand what's happening on the farm, and can help out at pinch points. If there happens to be a big crop that needs to come in, they can go and do that. And as part of that, there's often solidarity shares. So people that have a bit more income within the community can pay a little bit more, and people who can't afford as much for their share in getting part of the harvest still get their share of the harvest for a more affordable price. And so that can open up ways that we can share our income levels more fairly, so that everybody has access to that good food. And it means
that's a very good idea. Security.
Yeah,
very good idea. There's also, do you have these consumer co-ops in the UK as well, where people that, for example, live in urban areas a bit further away from the food production can buy directly from groups of small producers, diverse producers?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, right now, there's a lot of farms who were affected by COVID-19 with the with the closure of restaurants and pubs, and they were producing things to sell to those catering facilities, and so we've been trying to set up some systems where those farms can be delivering directly to parts of big cities where people can't afford the high prices that might be at some of the very fancy, like, kind of farmers markets or high-end stores selling organic food, but doing those deliveries direct in, and because they're selling directly to those consumers without the high-end shops taking a cut, then it can still be an affordable food product for them. And so they've got a market directly supplying people who are in need of food in food deserts and cities. And so that's been a really interesting experiment, setting up some of those supply chains and those co-ops. But they also existed pre-COVID-19. We just feel like it's something that's a solution.
Well, I know them from, they've had a huge, I think they started in Japan with the Saikatsu movement, which basically have spread all over Japan, with lots of households, I think something like 11 million people getting food directly from farmers through these consumer co-ops. We also have it here in Denmark. With a lot of food co-ops. There's one in Copenhagen that has like 3,000 members, and they only buy from local producers and in season, obviously, produce, and it's organic. And it's also a great way of building community, aside from getting healthy food and building up a local food system, a strong local food system. Let's hope that a lot of these initiatives will keep growing and after COVID-19 as well. So because there is a growth in it, and I think our challenge now to make sure that it doesn't just become a temporary measure. As you say, a lot of this has been going on.
It's a part of building back better. We call it building back better, where we just when we build back, there's huge amounts of investment going back into the economy now, so that we can recover from this crisis, and we feel like if more of that can be invested in local food systems, that means you're going to have more money circulating within local economies. You've got more jobs that are green jobs in people farming, and food production and food distribution, and more jobs in connecting people to farms as well, whether it's farm education or all the different kinds of social prescribing and things that happen on farms. All of these can be part of the economic recovery package from COVID-19. It means we're going to build something that's much more resilient for all the future crises that will happen. We are facing a nature and climate crisis, which will have an impact over the next decades, where it's very likely that we'll have more crises we need to face. And local food systems have proved to be so resilient, and because they're embedded in communities, able to get to people who have been vulnerable or isolating very quickly. With all the box schemes, they responded so rapidly. There was 114% increase in sales of vegetable boxes. And, the producers who were at the beginning of their planting season here, just produced more crops, bought the right equipment, and responded really agile, in a really agile fashion to what was happening to get that fresh, fruit and veg, which people need for good health, straight to their doorsteps. And, when we can illustrate that resilience, we can talk to governments about saying, when we build back, we've got to build back better, and we've got to build resilience and local food systems into the solutions. And
get more young people into farming. Because that's another problem, that we have an aging farming population, and we've got lots of young people that really want to get into farming but don't have access to land and so forth. So that's another challenge that we really have to meet. And I think local food system is probably the best way to go there as well. This is what will provide the jobs, and that has a chance of making the possibility of a dignified livelihood real. It's certainly not going to be in the industrial food system.
Yeah, I mean, employment's going to be a challenge, for the rest of the century, really. Where we try and create enough good quality jobs for everybody. And there's been a trend where governments thought, well, we're going to move people out of farming, we're going to move towards robotics, and or just import all our food. And I think we're realizing there's only so many jobs out there in the leisure sector and other sectors. We've actually got to think back to what are the basics. And food is one of the basics. And if we can have good quality jobs in the food and farming sector, and people want those jobs, then government needs to invest in those. And, that might be startup grants for new entrants to farming. It might be training. It might be access to land. And it might be through setting up cooperatives. Whatever it is, that investment needs to happen.
Absolutely. Very, very important. It's key for the survival of our local economies and our food security.
Yeah. We've definitely got people interested. I think, sometimes there's this perception that nobody wants to go into farming, and that's just not true. Here in the UK, we've recently done a survey of young people and put out, the word saying, okay, if you're interested in going into farming, if you'd like to start a farm, respond with all of your details, and we've gotten a tremendous response to it. And and often it's people who want to start now, and into the future if they get the training and the skills. And I think there's a real vibrancy to that movement. People find it very creative, empowering, and they just want to do it. And so hopefully that can be an inspiration to people across the world.
Yeah, and I think it is a trend across the world too. I think really just like it's a myth that industrial agriculture is feeding the world. It's also a myth that young people don't want to be in rural areas and they don't want to be engaged in food production. Obviously, they don't want a livelihood they can't survive from. So as long as we keep it in these conditions where people can't make a decent living, obviously, it's not going to be an option. But when that is an option, a lot of people want to take it. So I've got two examples. One from Japan, where at one point in Japan, they were experimenting with offering a basic income for small farmers, saying, if you go below that, we will support you. So they just had that basic income.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And people were moving back. Lots of people had gone to study and had careers and were moving back to their family farms because that's what they really wanted. But of course, it wasn't a choice if you can't live off it. And I've got other examples from Costa Rica, for example, where a very successful farmers market, in organic farmers market in the capital, suddenly gave the possibility of a lot of families of a dignified livelihood, and they suddenly found that their sons and daughters also now wanted to be a farmer because the opportunity was there. So it's not because people don't want to be in rural areas, they don't want to be engaged in farming. We all know we have to shift away from a fossil fuel dependent economy. If we're moving towards an economy based on renewable energy, we will need more hands on the land when we are not have it all propped up with fossil fuels, no? Yes. So there will be an opportunity for more jobs and more dignified livelihoods within local food systems, not within a global food system, because then we are ending up competing on the lowest common denominators, be it environmental standards or welfare and so forth.
One thing we're really clearly seeing is that there's a lot of people who have very professional backgrounds, have gone to university and and studied, or have skills also maybe doing something like computer programming or business skills that are going into farming as a part-time thing. And that, I think that's one of the newest trends around the world, where there's people who are doing part livelihoods on something that's office-based or computer-based and partly on the land. And I think this is a really promising trend, because it means we have a lot of people with very multifaceted skills able to bring farming to a new level, look at science and, and the science of agroecology and organic farming systems, and, really good at marketing things and really good at, advocacy and other things at the same time as they're farming, and we no longer need to see farming as something that's backwards or that's not a progressive occupation for people of any income status or any place in the world. That is something we can mix skills with, and it's really, really important way to go forward in the future.
Yeah, and important to point out, there's not because agriculture has been backwards, but it has been made to look like that, with this focus on everything that has status is urban. It's maybe computer based around money, and as far away from a real living economy as possible. It's
definitely.
Yeah. I also see a lot of promise in that. Those new visions and outlook and skills can really help to raise the profile of and dignify agriculture again, as long as we ensure, as part of our political work, that we change the mechanism exactly so that local economies and local food economies can survive and don't become marginalized in an otherwise rigged system in favor of distant shareholders and speculation. No?
Yeah. We had a campaign this year in Via Campesina saying "proud to be a peasant," because for a long time peasant, sometimes in English it has a derogatory meaning, where people say, "Oh, it's backward, it's dirty, it's ignorant," and we're saying no, that's not what it meant. It means that you work the land, and there's tremendous amount of pride in it, and we're proud to be peasants. And it's changing that attitude towards peasant farming and seeing that it is the way forward for the future.
And just here at the end, what kind of impact do you feel you're having with your message at the moment in the UK through the Landworkers Alliance? Because we were saying you are getting your voice into the media, you are sitting there also at the negotiating table to some extent. Do you feel you are having an impact?
Oh, absolutely.
Are you being heard?
Yeah. I mean, right now in the Landworkers Alliance, we really feel that we've got, tremendous political connections and support, where before, maybe 4 years ago, before we got ourselves to the table, the terms agroecology were really kind of unheard of and not understood very well. And now, every MP knows what we're talking about when we say agroecology, because there's been such a tremendous amount of support from, our members and from people who want a better, fairer food system, you know, writing to their MPs and talking to them. We've been put on to different agricultural committees. So we sit at the table with the National Farmers Union, who's a much more industrialized farming union, and some of the very big environmental NGOs, you know, and continually saying we want food justice, we want agroecology, we want local food economies. And now that they're starting to shape the policy, we can really see that it's happening. You know, we're looking at what's emerging from the processes that are in place now. And so many of the programs we've been suggesting are starting to be taken up. They're starting to get budgets. They're starting to, you know, put money towards it. And we're, you know, like this year, we've been pushing that horticulture, that fresh fruit and vegetables should be getting subsidy, because they haven't been able to get subsidy, you know, because most fruit and veg is on very small areas of land. And now they're, you know, we're about to sign a contract with the government to do a big test and trial for 2 years of a scheme to try and support fresh fruit and veg here in the UK. And that's a really big deal, because, you know, we've been able to say, we want this, we want this, we want this. And now all of a sudden they're going, okay, we're going to work with you to do that. We're going to put a budget before it, and they're going to do a 7-year transition period to actually change that subsidy system over. That's a very real, tangible change in how our system works. And we think if we can keep pushing that, stay at the table, not let up on it, that we can make a really big difference for the future.
How did you get a seat at the table? What were, like, if you were to tell that story to others, if they're gonna, in other countries, gonna do something like that?
Well, I mean, you know, it can seem quite daunting at first, you know, and it comes down to being very practical about organizing, and organizing as a social movement. You know, a few farmers, we realized that the bigger farmers union was not very democratic, and it wasn't representing what organic small-scale family farmers wanted to see. And so we formed a union. There was 12 people at first. And you know, we made a constitution, and we organized, and we went around and we talked to other farmers, and we said, you know, join us. We're going to make a message here about local food. You know, what can we do together? And we built that up slowly. And then we made some policy documents. We said, okay, what is it that we need? Then we went and had a demonstration from our agriculture department. We made a big feast, you know, very colorful, and a big farmers market in front of the department. And some of the people started going, who are these crazy people outside? Then we started to talk to them slowly. We made a diagram of all the politicians that had some power in this area, and the main people to talk to, and we arranged appointments with all of them. And slowly we found people who are our allies, who really believed in what we were doing. And as we did that, we said, okay, well, who else do you know? And then as we started to do that, we asked very carefully, can we be on this decision-making committee? And can you put us on this one and that one? And slowly those politicians pushed, and they got us onto those committees. And throughout this whole process, all of our members were writing in and supporting what we were trying to do as we put the word out to it. And after time, you know, it may seem like a little bit overwhelming. You might put up some legislation and it doesn't get voted for, and you think, oh, it's not working, you know, what are we fighting against? But then those politicians that did side with you and did vote for what you're doing, they'll keep pushing, and they'll keep up the pressure. And so it's not like everything's lost if not one thing succeeds. It's about building that momentum. And so you can start very small. It's not hard to start. And then, you know, build that up by being open and being strategic, and slowly, you know, trying to build a movement.
What kind of time frame are we talking about from the start to now?
We started in 2012.
Well, it's not a long time.
Yeah, 8 years, I think. So
it's not, considering what you achieved in all that time. And sitting,
you know, and
now
I think,
being,
you know, we're standing on the shoulders of all the tremendous political advocacy of Via Campesina, you know, and the more you can learn by joining with others. You know, we've shared knowledge with movements across Europe and across the world who've, you know, explained to us, well, what do these trade agreements mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? And we're building on that knowledge, and we see what's successful. You know, something might have worked in Germany, or something might have worked, you know, in India, and what can we do to replicate that here? So by sharing that knowledge with each other, we can build more of a critical mass, because there's a lot that needs to be changed in a very short time frame if we're going to reverse a lot of the crises we're facing. And, you know, that working together, that knowledge sharing is going to be critical for us, making some huge differences.
And that's a very good example of how localization is not about isolation. It's about solidarity, no?
Yes.
And it's about collaboration. By focusing on localizing our economies and our food economies, of course, as part of that, we are not going to be isolated, because that is a little bit of a common belief. People think, oh, I'm not going to be talking to other people. And well, both of us are working in the localization movement from different angles, and we are constantly collaborating with people around the world and learning from others and teaching others about our experiences as well.
Yeah, well, social movements are what really change things, when something becomes a movement, that's when you see that critical mass of change across the world. And it can start small. It can start from a very small demonstration. It can start from, a boycott or somebody refusing to leave a seat of a bus. But, it's learning those things and sharing them and becoming a movement that can create that critical mass for change. And this is one of the most fundamental, important movements if we're going to have a sustainable food system for the future.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Jyoti. It's great talking to you and seeing you also.